Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Lewis, and I am the Acting Vice President, Academic and Provost at the University of Victoria. I'm so pleased to be here tonight to welcome you to this very special event in celebration of International Women's Day. As a mother, academic leader, and educator, International Women's Day is a very special day to me personally. Thank you to everyone joining us in person and on YouTube. Our event promises to be an inspiring and engaging conversation with some remarkable women who are leading change. We hope it will help to connect, inspire, and advance the dialogue around gender equality towards positive action. To begin tonight's event, I'm honored to introduce Councillor Margaret Charlie from Songhees Nation to provide a welcome to the territory.
Ai squachel hela, ai quanas konana hela, asa tsasikia, chahatlasan at Laquangan, ai kun stachel at the Elo Anuk at Laquangan, Tasiquilton Tanaman, Chahatlasa at Laquangan, Lewistonat Anatan, Chasalaa at Sartlip. So, good day, my friends. It's nice to see you here today. My name is Margaret Charlie. I'm from Songhees Nation. So what I've said is Tasiquilton Tanaman. My dad is Mike Charlie from Songhees Nation. Lewistonat Tanatan is my mom, Nancy Henry, from Sartlip. Haishka.
Thank you, Councillor Charlie, for your warm welcome to the territory and for starting us off in such a thoughtful way. UVic and all post-secondary institutions have a responsibility to lead and support efforts to break the bias. This includes, of course, creating more equitable access to education and opportunities in the workplace for Indigenous peoples and others experiencing barriers. It's important work for all of us. Before introducing our moderator for tonight's conversation, I'd like to extend a special welcome to distinguished members of the Legislative Assembly, mayors, and community partners who are joining us in person and virtually. Thank you for being here. I also have a few administrative items to share. First, we are recording the event for those who cannot join us live, and the link will be available on the Women Leading Change website. Second, we will have a Q&A session following the panel discussion. Those of you in the audience and those of you joining us online are welcome to submit questions throughout the event through the Slido website. So go to slido.com, that's S-L-I-D-O, sort of sounds like bingo, .com, and enter the code WLC2, all lowercase, so that's Women Leading Change 2, to post your question or upvote other questions. Or you can focus your phone's camera on the QR code on the screen, which will take you to the website. So those of you in the auditorium will be invited to come up to one of the aisle microphones to ask your question once the Q&A session begins. We will do our best to fit in everyone's questions, so please keep your questions succinct, relevant, and as always, please be respectful. Finally, I wish to remind everyone in the audience to wear your mask for the duration of the event, if you are able, per current public health and safety guidelines. That concludes the administrative items, and thank you in advance for your participation and engagement. Now, I have the opportunity to tell you more about the vital partnerships that made tonight possible. The event is sponsored by Global BC and co-presented by the University of Victoria and the Office of the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia. Our partnership with the Office of the Lieutenant Governor is a valuable partnership that provides an opportunity to work together in support of increasing equity, diversity, and inclusion. As Lieutenant Governor, the Honourable Janet Austin has been working to elevate voices and amplify the contributions of women and gender-diverse people. And at UVic, we are committed to upholding these values of equity, diversity, and inclusion in our living, learning, and working environments. We know that diversity underpins excellence, and that we all share responsibility for creating an equitable, diverse, and inclusive community. Tonight, you will hear from inspiring women who have overcome many challenges and who have taken those experiences to positively shape their approach to leadership. The conversation will also highlight the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women in the workforce and how we can redress them in a post-pandemic world. And so, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening. The Honourable Janet Austin is the 30th Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, acting as a representative of the Crown in the province and serving British Columbians throughout the themes of her mandate: reconciliation, engagement in democracy, and advancing equity and inclusion. Throughout her honours career, she has led with compassion as a champion for the advancement and empowerment of women and the promotion of gender equality and diverse workplaces. Please join me in welcoming her honour.
Susan, thank you so very much for a very generous introduction. And I have to say, I absolutely love my engagement with the University of Victoria. You're marvelous partners to work with, so many exciting projects, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to work with you. As always, it's important that I too acknowledge the Lekwungen peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt, upon whose traditional territory we gather today, and to thank them for sharing these lands in peace and friendship. Good day, dear friends. It's wonderful to be among you today, and I do mean that so very sincerely. Also want to express my personal thanks to Councillor Margaret Charlie for the gift of a traditional welcome today. Thank you again, Margaret. And I'd also like to introduce Lieutenant Commander Melissa Desjardins. She is a powerhouse leader in the challenging world of military service, serving in the Royal Canadian Navy, and she joins me today as my honorary aide-de-camp. And I wonder if you might just give her a round of applause for her splendid service. Thank you. Thank you, Melissa. So I want to start this evening by reflecting that in Canada, we've really made significant progress towards gender equality in recent decades. Canadian women enjoy a measure of legal equality that is not enjoyed or shared by most of the women in most of the countries around the world. There are many more of us in public life and in politics, and I would like also to acknowledge the members of the BC Legislature who join us today. They now comprise 42% of BC MLAs, which is quite an improvement. We're not quite at parity yet, but we're pretty close. So thank you all for being here. Women are now better educated than men in Canada and have moved into medicine, law, and business in large numbers. But the gender wage gap persists, and progress in the STEM disciplines, parity on C-suite and corporate board appointments, remains painfully slow. We've also made inroads into the construction trades, policing, and firefighting, although these environments can be particularly culturally challenging for women. There's some good news, however, when we examine the impact of the Me Too movement and other social equity movements on workplace culture. I've worried about backlash from these movements, but some promising research by a group of UBC researchers, they formed an organization called Blueprint, is showing that this effect, in fact, is not large. We see that both women and men are speaking out more about harassment and gender and racial equity. We see that men are significantly more engaged on issues of gender equity and inclusion, and they, contrary to expectations, they don't feel disadvantaged by programs to accelerate opportunities for women and other underrepresented groups. Women leaders are now perceived as charismatic, visionary, strategic, and assertive to the same levels as men, but are also viewed as more empathetic and inclusive. There's much to celebrate when it comes to women's leadership. However, there remains a rather large elephant in the room, which is the challenge of unpaid care that women face, really across all sectors in the economy, because, as we know, they continue to bear the primary responsibility for domestic work and child and elder care, an effect that has been intensified by the global pandemic. We don't have time to explore this topic in detail today, but I will say that I don't believe we will ever truly achieve equality in the workplace until we achieve equality in the home. So there's much work to be done ahead in that respect. The truth is that any quick perusal of the current stats will tell you that despite the progress of recent decades, bias persists in our workplaces and our communities. Is a reflection of long-standing cultural norms about women's role in the workplace and in the home, and is particularly acute for women of color, Indigenous women, and gender-diverse people. We're here today to talk with 4 extraordinary leaders, exemplars and role models all, about how we can work together to challenge the status quo, break the bias, and create that better workplace, that better world that we all envision and desire. Hi, Chika. Now, it is now my great pleasure to welcome our panelists to the stage. First up is Christina Clarke. Christina is going to join us now. Christina is the CEO of the Songhees Development Corporation. We're also joined by Ruth Mojeed Ramirez. Ruth is the CEO of the Inclusion Project. Sophie Lui, I think very well known to British Columbia as anchor of Global News BC, joins us on the monitor in the middle here. Hi, Sophie.
Hello.
And Allison Greaves with the Vancouver Island Construction Association has a very interesting story to tell as well. Thank you, Allison. Can we give them all a nice, warm round of applause? So breaking the bias is really about changing culture, which is not an easy thing to do. So I'd like to start by exploring what bias looks like for each one of you in your different roles and in your different workplaces. So Christina, I'm going to ask you to start with this one.
Thank you. So my experience working with Songhees First Nation is that bias has tended to come from external sources. As we engage with organizations and governments over the years, we find preconceived notions about what a First Nation is all about could be barriers to understanding. But within the organization, I didn't feel those kinds of biases. I didn't feel a bias as a female. I think the best way to describe an Indigenous organization to you is that it's a family. In fact, we call ourselves the Songhees Work Family. And we had an email came out the other day to welcome new people to our staff, and the response was, welcome to the family. And a family nurtures its members. It looks for their talents, it watches them grow, it sees how they handle adversity, and a family will offer opportunities to members as they grow into them. And that was my experience working with Songhees Nation, that I was allowed to explore what my strengths were, and those were recognized, and I was advanced along in my journey with Songhees Nation, and I feel very supported by them in my work throughout my career. Thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. Anybody else want to tackle this one? Allison, please go ahead.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about culture and bias in the construction industry. The construction industry is very, very old and has been around for centuries, and started certainly before women had rights, before women were allowed to work, and were generally expected to stay at home and raise children. And it really sort of became a bit of a toxic environment on site, and Behaviors that would have had you terminated in other industries were accepted on work sites. It was a very masculine place and unwelcoming probably for many of the men at the same time, and certainly for women. So as women eventually slowly made their way into the industry, not too many years ago, it still was unusual. It was a lot of harassment, there was bullying, and so we've come a long way, but it certainly started off in a very toxic environment, and not surprising that there weren't a lot of women.
Well, your expertise in human resources, I think, will provide very useful information for us as we continue the evening, so thank you. Sophie or Ruth, would you like to answer this? Sophie.
I could raise my hand in the Zoom room, but I don't know if any of you in person would actually see it.
I think that'll be good.
I'll just do this if I really want to say something. I think bias in my industry and in television specifically maybe is something that you don't see on camera as much, because we do have quite a few forward-facing or on-camera females, anchors, reporters. So you see those people on our newscasts every day. But where I think we are lacking and where we're trying to build and we still need to do a lot of work is sort of behind the scenes in our editorial, our management, our technical, all sorts of departments, I think, need to look at themselves and try to build a better reflection of what our community actually is. So that's one way I think bias shows up in my industry that maybe our viewers don't see every night.
And certainly that's consistent with what we hear from other sectors that have a very strong emphasis on technology. So thank you. And Ruth.
Oh, absolutely. And I really wanted to, I feel really privileged just sharing this space with all of you tonight. And I really wanted to speak from a personal place. For me, I think before I talk about what bias is, I will talk about what it's not. And it's very similar to how I would define inclusion. I like to talk about it as the power to be. And when I think of that, I think of all of the agency, all of the ability, projections, everything that allows me present myself, my best self, that gives me the voice to say, this is who I am, and just believing that you would take that for what it's worth. So bias for me is all of the stereotypes, all of the discriminations, assumptions, projections from other people's experiences that come to play in terms of how they see me or how they want to place my experiences in life.
So it's really about creating a culture that is welcoming, that people feel they have a place in, a place they belong. Yeah. Okay. I'd like to get a perspective, I think, from you on what you see as having changed. So based on your own observations, what kind of things have been successful in challenging and changing the status quo? And you might want to answer this either from your own personal perspective or from an organizational perspective. And I know this is an area that you have a particular interest in, Allison, so I'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. There's been so much change and growth, just even in the 8 years that I've been in this industry. And I started off having no idea what construction was or what anything to do with the industry whatsoever. And the first thing I did on my very first day was I went and picked up the mail, and there was a magazine that had a female CEO of a local construction company on it. And I thought to myself, maybe there is a future here for me, and maybe there is a place for us here in this industry. And it was really inspiring for me. And since then, we've been able to implement policies and practices, zero tolerance for bullying, for hazing, for harassment. And not only is it having this policy that's written down on paper and then hung up on the wall and nobody does anything about it afterwards, it's hiring the right people who follow those policies and have the right values that fall in line with them. It's also training your supervisors and your leaders to ensure that they're picking up on what's acceptable on the work site and what's not acceptable. There's absolutely a place for women on all these construction sites, but if your leaders aren't supportive of the rest of your team and your sub-trades also treating women with the respect that they deserve, then it's not going to go very far to have those policies or practices in place. So that's been a really big bonus. It's been great progress on our construction sites, and I know for many of them in this city as well. So that's absolutely one of the ways that I've seen progress.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's certainly true that if there is no commitment from leadership, or if that commitment is perceived to be false, all it does is breed cynicism and mistrust. So it absolutely needs to be genuine. People can sense when it's not. So have you found that the training that you provide to leaders, has that been embraced?
Yeah, great question. Years ago, when I was new to the industry, I would be faced with superintendents who potentially had 25, 30 years worth of experience in the construction industry and had a lot of experience on some pretty rough sites from decades past. And then there's little me, and I come in and I'm like, this isn't acceptable, and we need to treat our ladies and even our other men on site, no bullying, no harassment, you need to take this training. And it used to be, I used to get a lot of resistance. Who are you to tell me how to do this? I'm the expert here. And I'm not generalizing, some people were more open to it than others. However, now we see even, all generations of superintendents, of leaders on site are very open to the training if they haven't already been trained. So it's definitely becoming the norm. It's accepted. It's also expected that we're going to fall behind the 8 ball if we don't have our leaders trained in order to ensure a safe place for everyone on all of their sites.
So I'm curious to know whether you would perceive greater effectiveness in a project team that has that kind of leadership that lays out those demands, because I think that can be something that really helps to shift people's attitudes and willingness to embrace a more equitable way of leading.
Yeah, absolutely. In HR world, all the time, they'll tell you that happy teams are more productive and more effective teams, and I think that is true on all of our sites, on all construction sites, and in all industries. When people get along and feel supported and valued and appreciated for who they are, and it's genuine, then they're going to work harder for you, and they're going to put in a better effort. It seems very obvious and quite simple, but absolutely. Happy people are effective, productive people.
That's great, thank you. Anybody else want to tackle this question? Yes, please, Christina.
So I mentioned earlier that experience bias from external organizations, but as Songhees Nation endeavored to strengthen partnerships across the region, I was asked to represent the nation on community boards. That includes the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority, the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce, the South Island Prosperity Partnership, and the Victoria Esquimalt Harbour Society. And I was very pleased to be met at those tables with welcome. I felt my voice was heard, and as a woman and also as an Indigenous representative. And really, these organizations are making an effort to be more inclusive and more diverse, and it shows. And it certainly was my experience working with them that I was considered a leader among them. So I really appreciate the efforts that are being made in our region towards more inclusivity.
Yep, thank you, Christina. Ruth, I see your mic going up.
Yes, I've been just wanting to add on to that. In the space that I work in. And I found it really fascinating, Allison, that you talked about safety. So we do a lot of work with stakeholders and organizations who are trying to find the pathways around accountability, around equity and inclusion, and what that looks like. And what we're finding that's resonating quite a bit is thinking about equity and inclusion as a human rights thing, something that goes beyond, I don't mean to say just an HR prerogative, but it goes beyond just the responsibility of a select few within the organization, as opposed to something that's, participatory, that has to have the involvement of everyone. So what we're seeing is a shift in mindset. We're seeing, I'm sure if we've been looking at the news, seeing headlines, we're talking about the Great Resignation and the impact that that's having on women. But at the same time, we're seeing a certain form of reckoning happening within organizations. Many more organizations are paying more attention to the need to look beyond numbers and figures, to the need to address representation and what that looks like. As well, some of the things that have been happening in our world, Black Lives Matter, Every Child Matters, all of those social justice movement, those have been grassroots-led calls for accountability that organizations can't afford to deny or ignore anymore. And so what we're looking to do some more, while there is some applause, I guess, to be given to some of the work that organizations are doing around taking stock audits and things like that, but we're also saying it needs to go beyond just an unconscious bias training. It needs to go beyond just, we gather together for 3 hours or something, as opposed to something that really goes into the culture. So where we started this conversation tonight, I think is really getting us into the meat of it, which is addressing the culture question within organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very well said, and I thank you for your answer on that. Ruth, I'm going to take this next question to you. As I mentioned in my introductory comments, we see that women certainly have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic in terms of job loss, reduced hours of work, and shouldering a larger share of unpaid care. And we know that this is particularly acute for Indigenous women, women of color, and people of diverse genders. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about how we kind of redress the balance and bring this back into better balance. This is a big issue, of course, but it has been worsened by the pandemic. So your perspective on that.
Absolutely. The more we're talking about the push that's coming out of community and grassroots-led organizations and individuals who are clamoring for change at this institutional level, part of that call really clearly has been the call for collecting data, but not just collecting it, but also disaggregating data. So for instance, we want to look at what's the impact of COVID. We're all aware that, COVID has impacted people differently. It showed some of the gaps that exist in our world. We're talking about the gendered, in particular, gendered, racial, class-based divisions that we've seen. And so, for instance, we will find statistics that says something like 60% of the jobs that have been lost in the course of the pandemic were lost by women. And then you want to take a closer look. What women? Because we're talking about, for instance, we are, for where we're at as a society, we know feminism, there are some pathways in that. Gender equity, there is something for us to find and to learn in that. But then it's the question of whose values, whose voices, whose experiences are we looking to empower through all of this as well. And so to, I guess, bring it back again is, just that need to ask, to continue at a very simplistic level, to continue to ask ourselves that question: who's not in the room? Whose voice is not represented? What are some of the reasons? I can name one that comes to mind really, really quickly, and that's to speak to some of the power structures, age-old power structures that we've had that give voice to the experiences, to the expertise of certain people over others. And that's why you will find some sectors where it's male-dominated. It's not like we can't see what is wrong with those sectors, but we just haven't had that critical shift that needs to happen. We haven't changed our mindset around how we're hiring, What kind of language are we using? Are those language giving space to attract certain people over others? When we're measuring who gets, opportunities for professional advancement and promotion, what kinds of lens are we using? And so what continues to happen is, yes, we're talking about equity and inclusion and all of that, but it's not equity for everyone. Because if we don't take stock, if we don't, again, going back to that power to be, leave room for people to be able to define their own experiences and say, as a Black woman, these are my experiences in the workplace. It's different than those of, any other group. As an Indigenous person in the workplace, here are my own experiences. And if there's anything that I try to get organizations and people to do, when people give you the privilege of sharing their stories, please listen and honor it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that strikes me as being particularly important is for organizations to set up formal structures that actually do engage people and give people that opportunity in a structured way to be able to share their stories. I mentioned some of this research from the Blueprint organization, and this report, which was just released in January, has a section on the perceived effectiveness of various different approaches to building a stronger commitment to inclusion and valuing diversity in a culture. And one of the things that comes through very strongly is that opportunity to share experiences, because it really does help to shift people's understanding. And if you can create a culture where people are willing to listen, it can be incredibly powerful.
Absolutely.
I also think, just touching on one other point that you made, it's very interesting to see the fact that so many organizations are desperate for labor right now, and a competent labor, and are really confronted with the expectations of employees around greater alignment between the espoused values of an organization and the leadership demonstrated within that organization. And employees are demanding this. They're choosing to walk with their feet. They're leaving organizations where there isn't this alignment with their values, and they're joining organizations where they have a greater hope. And so certainly my expectation would be that we'll see that sinking in to a much greater degree. We'd like people to respond perhaps from an altruistic point of view, but there's a practical element as well which can be very helpful. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Allison.
if I could just add, even, taking one step further back, and encouraging young people into industries that were typically male-dominated in the past, like engineering, like construction management, like project management. There's so many viable careers and futures that many girls at a young age don't explore as an option because it hasn't been common practice, or they weren't getting support from their parents or family to go into those different areas. My daughter is actually going into grade 9 next year and has this wonderful list of electives to choose from that include engineering and drafting and woodwork, and it's really important to start encouraging our girls into STEM and construction and previously male-dominated industries, so that we can get them into these organizations who, are looking to diversify. It's harder to do when we're not getting them into the industry from an early age or encouraging it.
Christina or Sophie, did you want to add anything on this point?
I did want to add something about, I think it was something that was said earlier, maybe by Ruth, about which voices are being heard in the room, or which voices are being allowed into the room to start with, and then who gets to speak when they're actually in the room, which reminds me of something else. We've all been in a meeting, in a boardroom, where there can be aggression and lots of raised voices. At least these are the meetings I've been in. And the men can sometimes get very loud and very aggressive, and the women don't say anything and aren't called upon and don't speak up. So I think one of the things we can do is ask for those voices to say something. Take that moment to say, Janet, what do you think? When Doug and whomever down at the other end of the table have had their moment of back and forth for the last 5 minutes. But the thing that I was going to respond to with Ruth was one of the things that I want us to do, and we have been doing it global, but we need to do more of it, is try to put more women in our newscasts, not anchors and reporters reading the news or reporting the news, but female experts and female spokespersons. Female and females of different colors and non-binary spokesperson. We need to put that kind of diversity on TV as well, I think, so that we're reflecting society and just showing that this is, a woman can be in construction, a woman can be whatever, and they can have the expertise. We don't need to necessarily draw attention to the female engineer, but the fact that we're putting that person in that role of spokesperson or expert, I think, is an important one to do, and we need to do more of that.
Sophie, that is such an important voice, and I think some people here might know Sherry Graydon, who's had a long time career in public advocacy and communications, and she has formed an organization called Informed Opinions. And the whole purpose of this organization is to encourage women to take advantage of those opportunities to speak publicly on issues, because they're much less inclined to do so than men, and they need more encouragement. So that's her whole focus. So any other journalists here, I definitely take a look at Sherry Graydon's work or website on Informed Opinions. She has all kinds of female experts who are willing to talk and have received some encouragement and support on a whole range of topics. And so I think she you know her, right?
Yeah, she did speak to us. And I would say, from a journalist perspective, we need to make sure that we're making space for these voices, but also understanding if they're not available and not ignoring them the next time. We have to keep going back because it's not the norm that we would go to these voices. We need to make it the norm.
And I know, when I think about the challenges that people in journalism are facing right now, you are so short of time. People are multitasking like crazy. And so I think it's easy to go back to someone that will deliver a good comment. So I think we all need to take some responsibility to encourage people to put their names forward, to encourage them to make themselves available for these opportunities. And I think we'll bring good results, but it's a really great point. The other comment you made about supporting people in these conversations, which can sometimes be challenging, I totally agree with, and I've always believed that when women get into positions of power, they need to support other women. So when you're in a position to say, hey, that was a great answer, that was a great suggestion, Sophie, tell us more about that. We can support each other to amplify the voices of people who perhaps aren't getting the airtime that others are. So I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction now and ask, we've just got an example here of some tactics and tools that we can use for challenging the status quo. So how can we be good allies to other women who are facing challenges or people of diverse genders who are gender non-conforming? I'll give an example, I think, from my own experience. Sometimes when you want to challenge what is a commonly held view in a group, and that you will probably be the only person raising this question, what I like to do is to put them on notice a bit. So instead of just launching into, an oppositional point of view or something that might be perceived as oppositional, give them a little warning and say, I'm going to challenge you on that, Bob, because I think if we look at it from this perspective, it may bring a different dimension to our decision-making process. And so it's a little minor thing to do, but I think it gives people space to reflect and not respond immediately in a defensive posture. And it makes it easier for them to actually listen to what you have to say. So it's a simple little trick. I've always found it really helpful. But I'm wondering if any of you have other ideas that you might want to share with the group here today.
I'm definitely using that trick.
Any other tools? Sorry, Allison, go ahead.
I completely agree with you, and Sophie also, encourage other women to speak at the table. What have you got to say? I heard you brainstorming this the other day, and you had some really great points about it. Can you share it with the team, or can you share it with the rest of the project managers, whatever it may be? I think, until it becomes more common for women to speak up naturally on their own at tables, we're going to have to start pulling it out of them for a little while, and it'll become more natural. It'll become the norm.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'll just add to that and say, so I've heard that the best allies are the ones who don't exactly put it on their foreheads, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And in talking about all of this, we can't shy away from the conversation around power. And for any one of us, whatever equity deserving groups or otherwise we belong to, there is a measure of privilege that we each bring into this space. There is a measure of power that comes with, it could be positional, it could be just by virtue of the life experiences that you have accumulated. And the question is, what are you doing with that? And I think for where we are as a society, as community groups, as organizations, it's really important for us to get really creative and tactful in terms of how we prod others on. I think fundamentally, when it comes down to it, if we all, took this as an assignment every day, look in the mirror, what power am I showing up with today? What can I do with that? Someone said, if we each took some time to, look out for the other person, then nobody would have any other need. Just as basic as that, let's bring that to the work world. Let's bring that to communities that we serve in as well. Who can I look out for today? Who in my boardroom can I, encourage along? Sometimes I'm in spaces where it's a woman chairing the meeting. Yes, that's a place of power, but then it's a group of men who find some collegiality, and there's a lot of unconsciously shutting down, drowning out the voice of the woman. And I'm putting my hand up, not because I have something to say, but just because, hey, we need to put the attention back where it belongs. Something as basic as that. And I think once we start to address those tiny, micro-level, interventions, we will start to see how that's forming a pool in the long run, and then we're addressing some of the more systemic barriers that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think this is true for many women, is we have to learn to be comfortable with claiming space. Yes. And I guess years ago, and many of us have had this experience, but years ago in a property development role, I remember being the only woman in an executive team, I had a lot of big projects that I was responsible for, and one of my male colleagues had one that he was working on, and every meeting he came and he would talk to us about how now we're driving the piles and we're laying the foundation, and I would have 8 or 10 of these things. And I needed to learn a lesson from this man, and he was a wonderful person, we're good friends, but it was how to claim space appropriately and not to be so diffident. And I think that's a challenge for many women, but I think for most of us, we're never going to be in danger of taking up too much space. So take a little bit more is what my advice would be. Okay, so I'm going to move us along. When I think of bias in the workplace, in the community, I usually think of it in 2 different categories. And one I'm sure we're all familiar with, which is implicit bias, the unconscious tendency to favor certain groups or people. And it's wonderful to see so many organizations now encouraging their employees to take implicit bias training, because it is an important way for us to reflect on the biases that we have, to embrace the fact that we may in fact have biases that are in direct contradiction to our stated values. And this is work that we can all do personally. So I would say well done to organizations that are encouraging that among their employees. But the second I think of, I always call, Ruth and Allison, you probably have a more formal word for it, but I call it organizational bias. And this is the extent to which established policies and procedures reinforce traditional stereotypes that maintain the status quo. And this is the kind of bias that in workplaces we really need to challenge. We need to look at processes around hiring, around training, around succession planning, because all of these things are really fundamental to opportunities to move forward. So I'm wondering if anyone's comfortable, oh, Christina, okay, talking a bit about that.
Yes. At Songhees Nation, when we were developing our human resource policies, we endeavored on indigenizing them. And really what that looks like is humanizing them and looking at the policy as a way to express our relationship with our employees and wanting that relationship to be healthy and looking at that through that family lens. How are we supporting that staff member? How are we developing their skills? So at Songhees, we made an effort to make sure that our policies used language that reflected our values, began with a value statement, and we made sure that the definition of family was appropriate culturally, and that we respected the employees, their families, their cultural responsibilities, and that's not just Indigenous employees too, the cultural responsibilities of other people that might work for Songhees Nation. The policy sets the tone, and that the organization wants to be a good place to work, wants to have a good relationship with the employees, and that's one of the first documents that they read when they come to work for an organization. So being really intentional about making your documents reflect your values and creating a workplace culture that people want to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important when you have alignment among those policies and practices and that people can actually see is others following those. So well done, you. Anyone else want to take this one?
I'll just add before you real quick, Ruth, sorry, that it's also, I agree with what you're saying, Christina, and it's been really positive to see lately in the construction industry that not only is it individual organizations picking up these policies and practices, but it's also provincial initiatives. There's things like the Builders Code, which has recently come out, which is its policies and practices. Its aim is to create a safe work site for everyone, with the goal of reaching 10% women in the construction industry by 2028. You can train your managers through it. You can train your site personnel through it. And you know, it's one thing, like I mentioned earlier, to have these policies and practices, but it's certainly another to enforce them and to see that it's not only organizational level now, but it's a higher level. It's great. There's also Don't Be a Bystander training, which the BC Construction Association, I believe, puts on, which is training men how to recognize treatment and behavior of individuals on site level, and to not just stand by and watch it happen. How do you react to that? How do you intercept it? How do you ensure that it is known that that is not acceptable on your worksite without creating a big conflict either? So it's great to see these provincial and sometimes federal initiatives coming in to help support organizations to pick up those types of practices.
Yeah, that's a program that was put together, I believe, by Ending Violence Against Women, Tracy Porteous, and it's been very successful. So really pleased to hear that you're using it in your work context. Ruth?
Yes, thank you, Anna. I just wanted to add, so I'll share a bit about the work that we do and how we support organizations. So I mentioned we do audits and things like that. And what we're actively investing in time, resources, expertise, and whatnot, is we're developing a series of workplace equity scorecards, which essentially is a framework that organizations across different sectors, we score them. We have a set of benchmarks and standards by which we score and see, you're at this level where, it could be reactive, it could be progressive, compliant, and all of that. And again, we do that across different sectors. And I would say one of the red flags that we find really early on is when we come in, so before we take organizations on at all, we're taking them through a set of pre-assessment questions, trying to understand the reasons why. Why do you need to do this? Is this just so that you can check the box? In the nonprofit sector, in academia, sometimes it's because there's a lot of government money available for us to do all of this training, so we want to tap into that. And for us, it's really important that we start to shift mindset around the need for this work and ensure that it's grounded from the get-go. But one of the red flags that we find really early on, Christina, you were talking about policies, processes, practices, and whatnot, is when we go into organizations, I want to say walk into, but we know we all live in a virtual world now, but when we do that virtual walk into organizations and we're asking, what's your policy on harassment? What's your policy on pay and things like that? Or, what's your value statement related to EDI if this is an area that you want to grow in? And when we start to hear responses that are akin to the HR person in the room is the specialist, the person, whomever it is, randomized person within the organization can't tell you this is what our vision is, these are our values, that really is already pointing to, because again, it has to be a culture that cuts across the board. And so we need to do a better job of communicating, ensuring that it's not just at this, conceptual level, but it's something that's actually lived. It's something that's congruent with the lived realities of people on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, we can get some great vision statements and some great value statements, but vision without execution is hallucination, right? You really need to have a practical way of making it live in an organization. Allison, it looks like you've got an extra point here.
Thank you. Great point. And this is something that we see a lot more, certainly in the construction industry these days, and certainly in my organization, is that we've had these core values for a long time. But are we practicing them on a daily basis? And more importantly, are we hiring the right people who stand behind those values, who have the same values, who are going to be making decisions in their everyday life, work decisions, professional decisions, personal decisions, based off of those values, which reflect what we truly believe in and what we want our organization, or how we want our organization to be reflected in the industry. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a really difficult thing to do. And like you said, the HR department is often the expert, but often we're one-person departments in the construction industry as well, certainly with the smaller organizations. So having that buy-in from your leaders is so crucial, because otherwise you're either going to see very, very slow growth and progression, or none at all. And I will say something. My dad, I used to complain all the time that, construction is just really slow and it's not moving as quickly as I'd like it to in the right direction. And he would say, you're not very patient, you're shifting the direction of a huge tanker, not a speedboat. This is an old industry. This is, their policies and practices and that have been, etched in stone, for lack of a better term, for decades or centuries. And so we're chipping away at it. It's going to take some time, but we're on the right track. We're making movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do feel that we're at a bit of a tipping point, and once we get to that sort of critical mass, I think we're going to start to see much broader change, and that certainly is my hope. Sophie, I'm wondering, did you want to add anything to this part of the conversation? I keep forgetting to look at the right monitor here.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
I think Ruth and Allison and Christina have covered it pretty well. The one thing I would say, I think maybe it was Ruth again who talked about, it's one thing to I don't know if I'm going to remember the words correctly, Ruth, but to fill a quota. I don't want to say quota, but to hire more women. But you can't just hire the women and then ignore them. They have to be utilized and nurtured and listened to. And I feel that at times, I was the first co-anchor, because the NewsHour was a solo anchor for since inception. So I was the first co-anchor and the first female, I think, on that show, which was great. And symbolically, it was lovely. But it doesn't mean anything if my voice isn't heard. So, and it is now, but it wasn't necessarily like that for me. I did have to speak up and remind people, hi, I'm here, and I don't just read the words. I have things to contribute. Everyone was very welcoming, but I think there was that, those deep-rooted biases, as you mentioned, that let them forget that, there's work beyond just putting a female there. You have to integrate the female into the system.
Absolutely. It's not just window dressing, and I mean, I've certainly seen examples of that, and it's enormously frustrating. But good for you, Sophie. That takes courage, it takes perseverance and persistence, and it says a lot about you that you've, gained the prominence that you have in our industry, and I personally feel very proud of you. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, I'm going to. I need to move us on to the formal Q&A section, but just before I do, I can't help but ask one final question of the group, and that's around this whole issue of unpaid care. Which is it's a huge challenge for women because, as I said before, they do continue to shoulder the vast majority of care in the home for children, for elder parents, and domestic work. So, can somebody willing to talk a little bit about what needs to change there? And that can be either in workplaces, it could be systemically in society, or it might even be just personal approaches that you found to be successful.
I'll go for
this one. For it, Ruth.
But I want to take it slightly different. I want to talk about, in my own community, we talk about something, it's called the black tax. And it's the unaccounted, often emotional labor that we have to put in. When you're the only Indigenous woman who has to shoulder the weight, you have to speak for an entire community group. And, as different as our experiences are, you're the one golden calf and we're just going to come to listen. That is very belaboring for us. Part of we're talking about equity and inclusion and shifting the narrative, breaking the bias and all of that. Part of the ways we continue to perpetuate these cycles of inequalities is when, we've got to do something different. The whole world is looking at us. Our websites need to look good. We need to have the great value statement. So we'll get the poster girl, let's call her that, who is black and she represents everybody else. And so she'll be the go-to person within the organization. She'll be able to speak for, any number of equity-deserving groups. That's not fair. If you're doing that in any of your departments, you're a team lead, again, what are you doing with your power? Even if they're in that place where they're just not able to use their voice, they're not able to voice it out. And often for us as racialized people, I would speak to my particular group, sometimes we have, women talk about imposter syndrome. For us, it goes deeper than that, where it's like, is it in my head? Am I getting it wrong? Am I just, whatever lower pay it is I'm getting, is that because, I'm an immigrant or, I supposedly don't have the same amount of experience? Those are some of the reasons why maybe racialized people, black women that I know, would not speak up as much. And again, it becomes that question of what are we doing to ensure that we're really shifting the traditional ways in which we continue to perpetuate some of these inequities. So beyond domestic labor, for me, it's also some of those really subtle, subliminal, if you may, ways that we tend to overlook people and the value that they bring to the workplace, to our communities, to our family settings too.
Thank you for that. And I think, that certainly reinforces for me the responsibility that those of us who do have positions of privilege and power, such as I do, how important it is to reflect on that and to make a conscious effort to encourage people to step forward and to create the space for those voices to express their views and to be welcomed in expressing their views. So it really comes down to that whole question of how we create a culture of belonging. All right. So nobody's grabbing the unpaid care questions, one of my favorite questions. So I'm going to move us along to the Q&A portion of the evening. I want to remind you that we are using Slido, and you can access Slido on your mobile device or computer. So you just need to go to slido.com, that's SLIDO.com. The page will ask you to enter a code, and you just simply type in WLC2, and that's all lowercase letters. So if you see a question that resembles one you wanted to ask, please upvote that in that one instead of posting a separate question. So we'll also be taking questions from the audience, and I believe we have a couple of mics in the aisles. And I'm going to start us with 2 questions from Slido. So let me just switch my implements here. Okay, the first question. What tips can you offer to women who don't feel confident in standing up for what they believe in? Oh, yes, please, Christina.
I think that the first thing you need to do to find your voice is develop your sense of self. What's important to you? What are your values? What in the world do you want to see change? What are you passionate about? And when you find that voice, when you find what's important to you, it lights a fire inside that helps you to speak up when you're speaking up for what's right and what's important. So I would recommend to people that do that inner work. And I think when we were speaking about leading up to this event, that was a common theme that we found is first you have to find your voice. You have to find your strength, and you have to step into, claim that space and step in and offer your voice.
Thank you, Christina. Anybody else? Ruth?
Yes, if I may just add to that, I would say when society, when you've been told over and over and over again, this is who you are, this is the name you're going to be called, and that name, that definition comes in different ways. It's the number of jobs you've applied for, but because you speak with an accent, you look different, you're told you don't have the Canadian experience. You're told again and again and again, whether we're using words or it's, you're not getting called back and things like that. So society is telling you, and I'm just going to, Christina, you said it, I'm just going to echo it. We need to re-examine the truth that we've come to own. We're talking about breaking biases. There are some of those that are outside. There are definitely some glass ceilings that we need to shatter, but then we need to talk to the person that's on the inside as well. And this is where the power of community come in. We talk about, the gendering of Canada's enterprise and things like that. And what we're finding is the lack of mentorship and support with women and things like that. In finding your own tribe, in finding people with common experiences, there's a lot that can be empowering in that as well. That's one where you start to shatter through the glass ceilings of whatever truths have been told to you over time.
When I was young, I had a friendship with a woman who was, she was a peer in the organization I was in, but she was quite a bit older than me and a lot wiser. And she gave me the most wonderful gift. So when she would see me admiring Sophie Lui or Ruth Mojeed Ramirez and really looking up to people like you, she would say to me, Janet, you are no different than those women. The difference is a few years and a bit of knowledge, And she used to make me apply for jobs that I was not qualified for. There's no way I was getting those jobs. And she knew that. But what she was doing was she was causing me to see myself as capable. She was causing me to reflect on what was really needed. You know, what skills does that person have that you don't have? And it, you know, it made a huge difference because she made me see myself as capable. And when you do see yourself as capable, it changes the way that you communicate. You know, I will always be grateful for that gift of informal mentorship, and that's something that I try to pay forward. Sophie, you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
I can only see you, Janet, so I don't know if, I guess that's a monitor over there that you're looking at of me. So I'm glad you were able to catch me. I just wanted to follow up on Ruth's talk. She mentioned the word find your tribe, and then you also talked about your experience, Janet. Like two things. One of the things that I do, and this sounds very childish probably, but it works for me. I will message one of my trusted female work colleagues in the room. We work in a big open space. We don't have separate offices. And I'll ask them, what do you think of this? Or they might do the same to me. Yeah. And sometimes that gives one of us the confidence to then speak up to the rest of the room. So it may sound very simple, you know, and very high school, but it seems to work for us somehow. And the other thing I would say, Jenna, just following up on what you just mentioned, those of us who have been in our respective businesses for some time, I think it's important that we also reach out to the younger, newer people, whether they're men or women, and just make sure that they feel welcome. And maybe it's only by you, but to check in with them and to see how they're doing and let them know that you're here if they have questions or comments or if there's something they're unsure of, and just keep doing that on sort of a regular basis.
Absolutely. So I think we have a couple of questions from the floor. I can't see you awfully well, but do we have a question on the right over here? Yes? You want to go ahead? Or no?
Sure.
Yeah, please go ahead.
What's something that helped you have confidence when working in a male-dominant environment?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
What is something that helped you have confidence when working in a male-dominant environment?
Great question.
Sure, I'll take that. And this is really kind of piggybacks onto the last question we just had, and I would say that a lot of it had to do with the women that I worked with in the industry, and it might not have just been in my organization, but finding other women in similar roles in the organization, and like Sophie said, you know, communicating and challenging one another and saying, you know what do you think about this? Or, you know, I just got this pay raise and it was really, you know, nothing, and there's still this big gap, and what do you make? And finding out, you know, the reality of other women around you, and, you know, then getting the support from them and saying, you know what, you deserve more than that. You can go get this, go after this. You deserve to be in this space. And feeling like you grow your confidence when you have your own little cheering squad. It's difficult to get really comfortable in a male-dominated world, and it takes a little bit of time sometimes. And I think that until there are more women in the male-dominated organizations and industries, that it might still take some time, and we're going to need to continue to find our own courage and our own confidence through leaning on other women.
Thank you. That's a lovely answer. Thank you so much for that. I think we have a question over here on the left as well.
I think he works here.
Oh, he works here. Sorry, I can't tell. Well, let me go back here to the Slido again. And a number of these questions are really connected. But I'll take us to this one. How do we engage in conversation when it is obvious that people don't believe there is a bias? How do we continue to have civil discourse? So when people have really entrenched views and they're not prepared to listen, how do you actually break through that? That's a great question. Go for it, Ruth.
We're looking at you, Ruth.
Thank you. The whole idea, the whole reason we're sitting here today We're talking about biases and how to shatter them, and I feel like that's what that question is again. Let's try to unpack what biases are. They're simply our own characterizations of the world based on our own experiences, based on what we've lived, what is realistic to us. And when we stay just at that level without acknowledging that the world being as diverse as it is automatically means that there are people in our midst whose experiences might not be the same as mine, whose worldviews might not be the same as mine. As long as we stay in that place, then nothing is about to shift in this narrative. And I would speak as a Black woman, as someone who's working with racialized people and different equity-deserving people. Sadly, what we're seeing, we talked about the great resignation. What we're seeing, I don't know why I said sadly, because on one hand, it is sad. On another hand, it's great kudos, where people are saying, we can't stick with the status quo. That means an exodus out of the workplace. We're shifting the language now from the great resignation to the great realization. We're seeing more entrepreneurship come through. We're talking about women breaking through the glass ceiling. That's because the women are starting to really voice, you can't hold me down. We're expressing that in different ways, and hopefully there will be more power holders that are willing to shift that. I'm not sure that I did justice to that question, but I just really wanted to mention that.
It's a challenging question. It's a difficult question. And I think sometimes we need to make an assessment of whether the fight is worth it, you know? You will have a sense of whether there's an opening, whether you can create that opening, take a wedge. And you can also assess whether you have allies in the room.
Yes.
And if you sense that people are receptive to your thinking, but perhaps afraid to speak up, perhaps that's something you can do behind the scenes, reach out to them, connect with them. And in numbers, there is strengths. But occasionally, we may be in a situation where we have to say, this culture is not aligned with my personal views and my personal values. How realistic is it that I can make a change? If you think there's an opening, then absolutely go for it. But if you conclude that perhaps there isn't, then you might want to join that great realization, because there is a lot of work out there, and people are really, organizations are really looking for labor right now. So, you know, it's a bit of a seller's market, I guess you could say. Allison?
I just want to say thank you for helping me see that perspective, because in HR right now, the great resignation is really hard to see the silver lining. But you're right. It's time for people to have a look at what they do every day and whether they're appreciated and they're valued and they're, you know, they're happy doing what they're doing and they're adding value. So I see that now. Thanks for bringing that up.
Sophie, yes, please, Sophie.
Oh, I was just going to say maybe what we could do in that case, I can't remember the exact question, but is for someone who can't see that there's a bias, doesn't think it exists, is instead of trying to break through to them, maybe we listen to them a little more and just try to get to the root of why they think there isn't a bias. And maybe there's something else there. I agree with you though. Sometimes there's just there's no progress to be made. So step away and come back another time. But listening to that person and just hearing them out first, and maybe you can find out what's really driving them or not driving them.
Yeah, you know, that is such a valuable perspective, because there's so many different reasons that people may hold the views they hold. Sometimes it's from fear, sometimes it's from lack of information. It can be from the group that they find themselves in that isn't necessarily particularly diverse in views. But giving them that space and honestly listening to them, at least you have an opportunity to build some trust. And once people feel listened to, they're very often much more willing to hear from you. So it's creating that space, I think, can be helpful. So thank you for raising that. I'm going to take us back here to Slido again. And I see that my favorite question is now top of the list. So you spoke to things needing to be more equal in the home before this may be reflected fully in the workplace. What work can we engage in towards this?
In the home?
I think it's the whole question of how we deal with the imbalance in unpaid care, because that is an impediment to women assuming leadership roles. So when I think of this, I think, there's really 3 dimensions to it. There are things that women can do individually. There are things that workplaces can create in terms of policies and structures that provide flexibility, that support families, and I don't mean just women, but encourage men also to play a stronger role in domestic care. And then there are also societal measures. So one example that I might give would be, we've seen a great sort of recognition across the country here in Canada of the importance of access to high-quality childcare, to facilitating women's participation in the labor force, but also to optimizing the productive capacity in the labor force. And that's something that has been, I think, broadly embraced, really across all sectors in the economy. So that would be one example. But I'm curious, and I think we have I think 10 or 15 participants who are also curious.
One way that the construction industry certainly can support this is our site hours are typically 7 in the morning, if not earlier, start time, and it is almost impossible to find daycare providers that will accept children at that early time of day. So for an employer to accommodate different or modified work hours in order to allow families to make it on time to work is a very simple, easy way to encourage more women into the industry, onto the sites, make it accessible.
And I think coming to terms with the M word, mental health, and understanding that it looks different for different people. Again, I want to go into that place where, I have heard, and I haven't fully explored this, I don't have a lot of wisdom around it, with Indigenous people talking about, even access to health care and what that looks like for us. Maybe there's an alternative way we want to be able to access that, shifting our thinking, again, going back to that question about inclusion and, distributing access, the ability, the agency that people have to be able to tap into support that is right and appropriate for them. I think that we can't talk about COVID without talking about the mental health dimension of that on women in particular, juggling both the personal, the professional, and all of the many different ways you need to show up still.
Okay, thank you. Christina?
So with Songhees Nation, one of the ways that, just 1 second, I've got a moment of blank in my mind here. So the question is, policies that support the family. Okay, that's what I'm trying to talk about here. So with Songhees Nation, I talked about the development of our personnel policy and our efforts to humanize that and to consider that each one of our employees has a life beyond work. They have children, they have a family, they have a spirituality, they have physical health, and they can't show up to work and be productive if their basic needs aren't met. So within our policy, we have things like flexible hours, the opportunity for job sharing, the opportunity to change your hours temporarily when there's something going on in your family, a recognition for cultural responsibilities, as I mentioned earlier. So because our goal at Songhees Nation is to create jobs that will support improving the lives of our members, we shaped the jobs around the people instead of forcing the people to shape themselves around the job. So we create jobs that are in alignment with living a life. And so what we end up having is a lot of retention. People want to stay, and they feel a lot of loyalty to the organization when the organization has supported them through their difficult times and through their positive times. Like a little bit extra bereavement leave and just more understanding about what it is to be human and how you have a life beyond your job.
And isn't that the most sensible way to go? You know, really, when you think of it, if it helps you retain your employees, creates a culture where there is a greater degree of engagement, it's going to make you more productive and more effective.
I'd have to add, the other thing we do is welcome children into the building. And when we designed the Wellness Center, we actually thought about children coming into the building to find their parents. And how easy would they be? We designed our security around wanting children to feel at home in the space when they're running around looking for mom or dad. And they're welcome there. And their parents know that. So that.
Great. Thank you. Okay, here's a good one. This question has a lot of support. How do you help quiet your imposter syndrome and know your worth and how that translates to pay? Anyone want to take on their imposter syndrome?
I don't have it. I haven't heard of this one.
Oh, it took me years.
I'm not finished with mine yet.
I still have it.
Sophie,
Yeah.
please go ahead.
I don't know how I quieted it. I guess being in the business for as long as I have been. But it took a long, long time of feeling insecure. And there's still a little bit of insecurity, but I think I'm past the bulk of it now. Yeah. Knowing and asking for that pay, I think it took 20 years of being in the business and then the frustration just built up. That's not really what I would advise for anyone else. Don't let it build up for 20 years. But, if you know what you're doing, and I'm sure you do know what you're doing, you know that everyone has imposter syndrome. I'll say that. Everyone has it to some degree. So you're not alone. You're not the only one who feels like maybe I'm not really cut out for this. They hired you, so you are cut out for it. And you haven't been fired, so you are cut out for it. So you are worth it. You are worth what they're going to pay you, and they're not going to pay you more unless you ask for it, and unless you tell them. And sometimes you have to remind them what you're worth, because they have a whole bunch of other employees that they're thinking about too. But this is something that I struggle with, making sure that. I don't struggle with the imposter syndrome as much, but struggle with making sure that I'm kept on an equal footing, whether that be in terms of my compensation or just recognition or projects or things like that. That's something I think you always have to keep an eye on. But you are cut out for your job because you have it, and you still have it.
Yeah, and that's fabulous advice. It's kind of like feel the fear and do it anyway. Okay? Anybody else want to take this one?
I want to add something to that. So one of my favorite quotes says, I come as one, I speak with the voice of 1,000. And that's speaking to all of the voices, all of the experiences that have gone ahead of me, that have empowered me to show up today. And talking about, Sophie, I think you just were super wise in putting it the way you did, where, yes, sometimes we have those things in our heads that are reminding us what qualifies you to be in this space. And guess what? Maybe you won't be able to answer all of those questions. They talk about faking it till you make it. This might be one of those. And sometimes it's in starting that journey, it's in walking the journey that you understand why you're on that path. Sometimes it's in allowing yourself, giving yourself the freedom and the space to step into it that you realize, oh, this is the reason why. And that's where I would just hang it. Just allow yourself, embrace all of the experiences, the highs, the lows, knowing that even when you fall on your face, as we like to call it, even that is part of the experience. And everyone that we're looking up to, everyone who is representative of, who's representing whatever, high stakes we're looking forward to, they've also walked that path too. So it is okay. It's okay to have those questions. It's okay to not have all of the answers, as long as you continue asking asking them, you're getting closer, much closer to where you need to be than where you started from.
Thank you, Ruth. And I think what you say is particularly wise. You know, we've all made mistakes. When it comes to mistakes, I've made them all, I declare. But it is sometimes in those moments where you take some risks, and sometimes they work out, and sometimes maybe not quite the way you'd expected, but that's often when you have those periods of accelerated personal growth, and you can learn so much from that. So I'm unfortunately going to have to bring us to a close in a moment. However, I do want to give you one final opportunity to perhaps quickly give a comment to one final question here, which is, what advice would you give to your younger self on how to break the bias? Or maybe just what advice would you give your younger self?
Don't be so serious. Relax.
I'm with you on that one. Sophie?
Sorry, I had to unmute. I like that, don't be so serious, and the relax. And I also like what Ruth mentioned about, you know, sometimes you're gonna fall down and fall on your face, but you just dust yourself off and get back up again. I would add, this is a journey for me. You know, I've been doing this for 25 some odd years, something like that, but I'm not even close to being done. I hope my boss is listening to that for the next time I sign a contract. But I'm nowhere near being done, but not just with the job, but with the learning process. So learning how to speak up more, learning how to empower others. It's all part of my career and part of my life, and I think hopefully it'll just continue.
Thank you. Allison?
For me, when I was younger, I think I had a very distorted view of what success was, and so I think I would tell myself to relax, and you know, you deserve to be there, and success will follow. It doesn't really have to, you know, look the way, you know, the big CEO positions and this and that. As long as you're following your heart and you're true to yourself and genuine, I mean, there's a lot of success in that. So I'd say relax. You're doing fine.
And Ruth?
Yes, I would say you are not alone. While according to Sophie, like it's your personal journey and there are certain things that you would face, but as long as there are gatherings such as this, where we're having a conversation that's even remotely akin to this, you should know that people are going ahead of you to shatter that glass ceiling. And there is space for you to step into that. So you're definitely never alone in this.
Thank you. Thank you all. You're all marvelous, aren't you? I wonder, can we give our panelists a really great, resounding round of applause? Thank you. You are truly an inspiration to all of us, and I want to say that you're certainly an inspiration to me, so I thank you so much. So the international organizers of International Women's Day have given us a bit of a challenge this year, and it is to imagine a gender-equal world, a world free of bias, of stereotypes, of discrimination, a world that is diverse, equitable, and inclusive, and a world where difference is valued and celebrated. So to me, this is a vision worth working for, it's a vision worth fighting for, and I want to thank all of you in the audience, in our virtual audience, and especially our wonderful, fabulous 4 feminists on the stage for being part of creating that vision of a society that we all wish for. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the evening.